All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the wildest stories of the 20th century, using the source material to figure out how one of the most powerful navies on the planet just decided to sink itself. Seriously.
I mean, think about that for a second. Why would a navy destroy itself? It's a crazy question, right? Well, the answer starts with an even crazier order. We're in the final chaotic days of World War I. Germany is on its knees, about to collapse. And what does the Naval High Command do? They decide to go out in one last blaze of glory. But the sailors who are actually supposed to do the dying? Yeah, they had other ideas.
So get this, the German army is basically shattered. The government is desperately trying to get an armistice signed. But for the admirals, the idea of just surrendering their beautiful, powerful fleet without one last epic showdown, absolutely unthinkable. They called it a death ride, and for them, it was all about salvaging the Navy's honor, even if it meant every last ship and sailor went to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, but what the officers called honor, the thousands of regular sailors called a pointless, stupid death sentence. I mean, these guys had been through years of hell, and they were not about to get sacrificed for their commanders' egos in a war that was already, for all intents and purposes, over.
And this was the moment everything changed. Instead of raising the anchors, sailors on these huge battleships just put out the fires in the boilers. They flat out refused to go. And that single act of defiance was the start of a mutiny that wouldn't just save their own skins, it would literally bring down an entire empire.
Okay, but a mutiny like this doesn't just happen overnight. It wasn't spontaneous. That refusal to sail, that was just the spark. The fuel for this fire, this deep, bitter resentment, had been piling up for 4 long, miserable years.
You see, the German Navy was basically split right down the middle. On one side, you had this elite, aristocratic officer class living the high life. And on the other, you had the regular enlisted guys. A lot of them were factory workers from the big cities, very aware of class differences, and they were treated horribly. Subjected to brutal discipline, looked down on. It was like 2 different worlds living on the same ship. They even had a name for it, Castergeist, this rigid caste spirit.
And nothing paints a picture of this misery better than a diary entry from a guy named Seaman Richard Stumpf. He said they spent most of their time just worrying about their stomachs. While the officers were having fancy meals from their own private kitchens, the crews were literally starving. They were eating these thin, awful soups that they called, and this is grim, chopped barbed wire.
See, here's the thing. Unlike the army, the German fleet was pretty much stuck in port for most of the war, blockaded by the British. So what did that mean for the sailors? Crushing boredom, day after day. You combine that with being hungry all the time and getting constantly humiliated by your officers over petty stuff, well, it's the perfect recipe for a rebellion. Morale was just completely in the gutter.
So the first little mutiny at a port called Wilhelmshaven gets stamped out pretty quick. The leaders get thrown in jail, but then the admirals make this huge mistake. They order the fleet to split up and go to another port, Kiel. They thought, hey, let's separate the troublemakers. What they actually did was spread the fire. They sent the rebellion to an even bigger, more volatile naval base.
And in Kiel, it just exploded. We're talking thousands of sailors pouring into the streets, and they're joined by the city's workers. They totally overwhelmed the local authorities. They started forming these revolutionary councils, kind of like the Soviets in Russia. And bam, within just 48 hours, they were in complete control of the entire naval base.
And listen, they weren't just asking for better food anymore. Oh no, they came out with this list of demands, their 14 points, and it was basically a revolutionary manifesto. They wanted freedom of speech, all political prisoners released, and, this is the big one, they declared that all power now belonged to their council. This wasn't a mutiny anymore. This was a full-blown revolution. Man, the news from Kiel was like a lightning bolt. When word got out across Germany, a country just sick and tired of war, that these sailors had successfully taken over, it was all the inspiration people needed. Uprisings started popping up everywhere against the old imperial government. And it happened so fast. In less than a week, that sailors' revolt snowballed into the German Revolution. These workers' and soldiers' councils took power in cities all over the country. The monarchy was just gone. The Kaiser packed his bags and fled. And what was the very first thing the new government did? They signed the armistice. The war was over. A mutiny on a few ships had brought down an entire empire. It's just incredible. But wait, the story of this fleet isn't quite over.
The war might be done, but the ships themselves, they were now facing a future that was, well, deeply uncertain and pretty humiliating.
Okay, so part of the armistice deal was that Germany had to hand over its fleet. So you have this huge, somber procession of German warships being escorted by the British Royal Navy all the way up to this remote naval base in Scotland called Scapa. And there they sat for 7 long months, a whole fleet just held in captivity. That's 74 of Germany's biggest, baddest warships, just sitting there, helpless. All their skeleton crews could do was wait while the politicians in Paris argued over what to do with them. Were they going to be scrapped? Or, maybe even worse, would they suffer the ultimate humiliation of being divided up like prizes among the winning country? Well, the German commander on site, an admiral named von Reuter, he got word that the final peace treaty was going to force him to surrender the ships for good. And he basically decided, nope, if Germany can't have this fleet, then nobody can. He gave a secret, prearranged signal to all his ships, and just like that, all across the fleet, German sailors started opening the seafocks, the valves that let water in. They smashed pipes, they sabotaged everything they could to make the ships sink faster, and then they abandoned ship. The British guards were caught completely flat-footed. In just a few hours, 52 ships, including most of Germany's massive battleships, just disappeared beneath the waves. It was the single largest act of naval self-destruction ever. The reaction was mixed. Back in Germany, the old naval command was thrilled. They saw this as the ultimate act of defiance, something that wiped away the shame of surrender and restored the Navy's honor. Publicly, the Allies were furious, but privately, a lot of their commanders, like the British Admiral Wemyss, were actually kind of relieved. It totally solved the huge, awkward political problem of how to divvy up all those powerful warships. And that brings us to the ultimate irony of this whole story, doesn't it? You have a mutiny that starts because sailors don't want to die in a pointless, suicidal battle. That mutiny ends up toppling an entire empire and ending a world war. But the very fleet they saved, it ends up committing suicide anyway, just to avoid the shame of surrender. So what was it? A final, defiant act of honor? Or just the last, tragic gasp of a navy that had already destroyed itself from within? Now that is something to think about.